Generally, when looking at Stalinism, that is the policies implemented by Stalin in pursuit of communism, the focus of the essay questions will be on the development of USSR from being a backward agrarian state into a modernized, industrialized, and military superpower placed against the great human costs. An essay on Stalin's 5-year plans also requires addressing and examining multiple perspectives related to the success of his policies versus the human costs. For us to be able to assess the policies, acknowledge different perspectives and interpretations, and reach an independent conclusion, the following questions should constantly play in our minds. Can success still be called success when lives were lost and human rights violated? Can human costs overshadow the benefits attained? A few people even argued that Stalin did not transform Russia but rather laid the foundation for the status of a superpower to be achieved after World War II. This argument was refuted by physical evidence and the military capabilities of Soviet Union during World War II. Not to mention the fact that such arguments would mean going beyond the timeframes of Stalin's 5-year plans, that is, from 1928 until 1939. Many agree that he was successful because historians believe that the Allied victory over Germany during World War II was due to Russia's success in industrializing itself to be in a stronger position to resist German invasion. So our line of questioning should be, if some historians decry that development came at great human costs, shouldn't one also argue that most nation-transforming programs come with great human sacrifices? Could such large-scale transformations have been possible in a short space of time without any human sacrifices and without some degree of a centralized totalitarian control? Was success brought at the expense of human lives, or there was success despite human costs? Could it be that the loss of lives was inevitable given the historical context that Russia had been backward and thus not industrialized nor modernized, thereby translating to there having been no time nor heavy industries to necessitate the development of heavy industry-related safety regulations and measures, which can be explained by the fact that Russia had to bring in experts and volunteers like John Scott from Western industrialized countries like America? To successfully deal with this complex topic, we need to list down the key points we are going to cover in the essay. Number 1. We will briefly explain the reasons or goals of the 5-year plans under the centralized government and the Gosplan. Number 2. We will look at agriculture, focusing on collectivization and dekulakisation. Number 3. We will then look at industrialization, focusing on the building of industries and towns, the construction of communication infrastructure like railways, roads, power lines, and the building of the Dnieprostroi Dam for hydropower electricity generation. Number 4, we will look at the effects of Stalin's 5-year plans, focusing on the working and living conditions of the workers. We will also look at education. And lastly, we will look at the political terror or the purges. As we look at these, we shall be placing the successes or benefits or achievements against the extreme state control, forced collectivization, intense political repression, that is the purges, gulags, and the secret police to crush all opposition, the use of propaganda which caused human suffering and death, while touching on the different perspectives surrounding Stalinism. Typical questions include those similar to the following. Question number 1. Joseph Stalin's 5-year plans were instrumental in transforming Russia's economy, highlighting that while some progress was made, it came at a significant human cost. Critically evaluate the validity of this statement. Use relevant historical evidence to support your line of argument. Question number 2. Stalin's policies on the Soviet people were effective and transformed the state into an industrial superpower. Do you agree with the above statement? Use relevant evidence to support your line of argument. Question number 3. Explain to what extent Stalin succeeded in transforming Russia into a superpower by 1939. Let's use the first question to attempt writing an essay. And the question is, Joseph Stalin's 5-year plans were instrumental in transforming Russia's economy, highlighting that while some progress was made, it came at a significant human cost. Transformation refers to the revolutionary developments that reshaped Soviet Russia's industry, economy, society, military, and world status. This compels us to specify in our introduction which type of economy Russia was transformed from and to which economy or economic status it was turned into. The statement acknowledges that indeed Joseph Stalin's 5-year plans enjoyed great success in moving closer to the Soviet goals. However, the statement also implies either the fact that the success was soiled by human costs and/or the fact that despite the achievements enjoyed, the outbreak of the Second World War prevented Stalin from reaching the final goal. The statement also provides room for those that argue that Stalin did not transform Russia but rather laid the foundation for post-World War II status of a superpower. The phrase significant human cost calls for us to look at the different ways and the extent to which people paid for the economic transformation. Critically evaluate the validity is assessing if the statement is truthful, accurate, correct, logically based on reason, while acknowledging different perspectives and interpretations of the impact Stalinism had on Soviet Russia. What this means for us is that we are not going to merely list, narrate, describe, or summarize events. We will need to analyze, interpret, and evaluate historical events by explaining the why and the hows with the use of evidence to support our response, while clearly linking our arguments back to the question as per the pure approach. To answer the questions, let's start our introduction in the following way. While historians debate Stalin's achievements between 1928 and 1939, the statement that the 5-year plans were instrumental in transforming Russia's economy from a backward agrarian economy, advancing it to a modernized and industrialized superpower, whilst causing significant human cost, requires a balanced assessment. This essay will examine the extent to which economic transformation through industrialization and collectivization was achieved, weighing them against the human costs through famine, terror, coercion, and exploitative labor. This would be done to ultimately demonstrate that the economic benefits or successes of the 5-year plans cannot be divorced from the systematic brutality that produced them. To evaluate the statement's validity, it is essential first to understand Stalin's motivations and the economic framework he established. Stalin's 5-year plans, the first one being from 1928 to 1932, the second 1933 to 1937, and the third 5-year plan being between from 1938 until 1941, although interrupted by war in 1939, were state-controlled economic programs designed to rapidly industrialize the Soviet Union. Stalin's 1931 speech highlighted the urgency of this. We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make this up in 10 years. Either we do it or they crush us. This reflected not merely economic ambition but the fear of being vulnerable to attacks by capitalist countries, particularly Germany. Stalin rejected Lenin's new economic policy, the NEP, viewing it as ideologically not in line with communist principles because it permitted some form of capitalism. He replaced it with centralized command planning through the Gosplan, the State Planning Committee, which set production targets, allocated resources, and monitored implementation. In agriculture, collectivization forced small peasant farms into kolkhozs, collective farms, and sovkhozs, state farms. Stalin pursued this policy for several related reasons. To demonstrate socialism's superiority over capitalism, which implied the bid to focus inwardly on Soviet Russia's development, which was interpreted as isolation by some historians. To guarantee food supply, to generate agricultural surpluses for export to fund industrialization, and eliminate the Kulak class he viewed as capitalist remnants. Having highlighted the reasons for the 5-year plans, let's consider the arguments surrounding the decision of USSR to focus on making socialism successful first in Soviet Russia before internationalizing it. Some historians argue that socialism in one country isolated the USSR internationally. However, this argument is weakened by the context of the Great Depression, which devastated capitalist economies while the Soviet Union maintained growth, proving that isolation did not bring negative effects. The isolation was arguably strategic rather than economically detrimental during this period. We can now look at some pieces of evidence that support that indeed there was economic transformation as a result of the 5-year plans. Examining the industrial evidence shows undeniable economic transformation supporting the first part of the statement. We will focus on heavy industry and infrastructure. The 5-year plans achieved dramatic industrial expansion. Over 1,500 new factories were established, including the Stalingrad tractor factory, which produced 144 tractors daily. Major industrial projects included the building of the town Magnitogorsk, which by 1938 produced 5,000 tons of steel daily, as reported by the American volunteer John Scott, who testified that without Stalin, the construction of Magnitogorsk and the entire Ural and Western Siberia industrial area would never have been done. Komsomolsk was built in the Far East for military production. The Kuzbass coalfields in Siberia were exploited. Baku became a major oil production center. The second 5-year plan developed crucial infrastructure such as the Dnieprostroi Dam, which provided hydroelectrical power for industrial expansion. The Taxib Railway connected Siberia with Central Asia for grain and cotton transportation. The Belomor Canal linked the White Sea and the Baltic Sea. The development of the Moscow Underground Railway, which opened in 1935, symbolized Soviet achievement with architecturally grand stations. Statistical evidence also demonstrates the said economic transformation. This includes the fact that USSR became the world's second most industrialized nation by the late 1930s. Its urban workforce expanded from 11 million in 1928 to 32 million in 1940. Unemployment was eliminated by 1930. Before we move on to the next point, let's critically evaluate what all this success meant for Russia and explain why this mattered to our question. This industrial capacity proved militarily crucial. Without it, the USSR could not have withstood Nazi Germany's 1941 invasion. This validates Stalin's previously mentioned security concerns, which were part of the reasons for embarking on the rapid industrialization path through the 5-year plans, demonstrating that they were indeed instrumental in transforming Soviet Russia. As we critically evaluate the economic transformation mentioned in the previous paragraph, we need to assess if success came in totality. Definitely it wasn't complete success, so we need to dispel the thought of complete or total success having been achieved. So we say, however, celebrating industrial statistics would mean neglecting significant economic failures that cast doubt on the transformation narrative. Agriculture failed due to collectivization, which proved to be economically disastrous. The policy resulted in agricultural production declining rather than increasing, as peasant resistance led to widespread livestock slaughter of between 25 to 55% in Central Black Earth region and 90% in Kazakhstan by 1930. There was also deliberate crop destruction, sabotage of farming equipment, and slow work in kolkhoz, as the peasants resisted collectivization. Dekulakisation eliminated the most productive farmers, replacing them with inexperienced collective farm managers. Mechanization of farms was counterproductive. With 26 million workers already on collective farms, mechanization created unemployment rather than efficiency. Youth migration to cities was driven by starvation, not by the need to seek genuine economic opportunity. Consumer goods were severely neglected because of the obsessive focus on heavy industry, which meant that ordinary citizens lacked basic necessities, thereby undermining living standards despite industrial growth. Consequently, there was great human suffering due to the resulting famine. At this point, let's consider the following debate. Some historians argue that the 1932 to 1933 famine was not directly caused by peasant resistance, citing favorable 1930 weather conditions and good harvests. They blame forced collectivization and dekulakisation, which was resumed in 1931. However, this interpretation ignores the Kazakh Ashashlik famine, which started late 1930 and lasted until 1933, which killed between 1.3 to 2.3 million people, which is an estimate of between 38 to 42% of the Kazakh population, demonstrating that the famine predated 1932 and was directly linked to the initial collectivization violence. Stalin's 1930 Dizzy with Success article, which blamed overzealous local officials for the peasant protests, claiming that collectivization was meant to be voluntary, was hypocritical scapegoating that caused temporary mass abandonment of collective farms by peasants, further destabilizing agricultural production. However, the Dizzy with Success article suggests that even Stalin himself recognized the failures of collectivization. At this point, we need to look at the human cost to challenge any notion of progress being made under collectivization. Collectivization gave birth to famine. Forced collectivization saw many human rights being violated. Collectivization was implemented through systematic coercion. Peasants were forced to vote publicly by raising hands to show that they were in favor of joining the collectivized farms. Voting against collectivization meant 10 years of forced labor in Siberia. This eliminated genuine choice, constituting clear human rights abuse. The speed of collectivization, which saw 60% of farms being collectivized between 1929 and early 1930, demonstrates the policy's coercive nature. Peasant resistance reflected genuine opposition, with livestock slaughter representing desperate attempts to maintain their freedom. Peasants viewed collectivization as new serfdom. Crop burning and equipment destruction were acts of defiance against the state theft of property. Closely associated with collectivization was the policy of dekulakisation, which is generally viewed by historians as a form of class genocide. Starting on January 30, 1930, dekulakisation targeted successful peasants, kulaks, who had prospered under the new economic policy. Some were executed, others were sent to Gulags, the labor camps. Many were deported to regions with poor land where they died from brutal conditions. This policy robbed agriculture of its most skilled practitioners while terrorizing the peasantry into submission, and famines broke out. The Holodomor in Ukraine claimed between 3.5 and 5 million lives, and was a man-made famine born out of the failure of collectivization. Another catastrophic famine was the one in Kazakhstan, the Ashashlik, which caused between 1.3 and 2.3 million deaths. State grain confiscation during famine demonstrated that Stalin prioritized industrialization funding over human life. Some historians argued that the Holodomor was deliberate genocide against Ukrainians, while others view it as the consequence of an ideological drive and not an ethnically targeted policy. Regardless of whether it should be called genocide or not, an intentional or an unintentional result, these deaths could have been prevented by stopping grain exports or by reducing requisitions. The blame thus falls on Stalin's regime, anchored on moral grounds. Even the 1935 policy of allowing small private plots and surplus sales by peasants represented mere recovery, not success. Millions had died without any net agricultural progress, signaling our stance of rejecting the interpretation of transformation and progress as complete. As a way of emphasizing that the human cost was significant, we need to look at the working and living conditions of workers that came with labor exploitation and terror. Beyond famine, industrial achievements were built upon brutal systematic exploitation and terror that further invalidate claims of genuine progress. Industrial workers faced deplorable conditions, which included long hours on 6-day work weeks with minimal rests. They worked in dangerous environments. Take, for example, John Scott described workers with frozen hands and clumsy feet falling to their deaths from scaffolding up the furnaces at Magnitogorsk. The high mortality rate among workers is also evidenced by the staggering approximate of 25,000 workers who died whilst building the Belomor Canal alone. In reality, workers effectively subsidized the 5-year plans through poverty as they received low wages. Their living conditions were equally catastrophic as there was overcrowding. For instance, barrack blocks housed 80 people each in Magnitogorsk. Poor sanitation led to bubonic plague outbreaks. New industrial towns like Magnitogorsk lacked running water and sewage systems. Hunger, bedbugs, and inadequate shelter killed many, especially during harsh winters. The regime portrayed workers as enthusiastic socialist builders, rewarding Stakhanovites who exceeded quotas. This was another form of coercion through propaganda. However, the workers' motivation stemmed from fear, not the love of socialist ideology. Managers and engineers were scapegoated for production failures. A popular example was the Shakti trial in 1928, whereby 53 engineers were falsely accused of sabotage, of which 11 were sentenced to death and 5 finally executed. Workers' lateness, absenteeism, and poor workmanship were recorded. Poor records led to accusations of sabotage, punishable by execution or forced labor. Propaganda came in the form of factory meetings, radio, posters, and theater, which convinced workers that they were at war with the West, manipulating them through nationalist fear. The result was that production figures were inflated by up to 1/3, and quality was compromised. This then is self-evidence that the targets were unattainable through legitimate means. Furthermore, Stalin's differential pay system that is rewarding Stakhanovites more betrayed socialist principles of equality. Left-wing critics correctly identified this as creating new class hierarchies, contradicting the goal of a classless society and exposing ideological hypocrisy. The industrial achievements depended significantly on forced labor through the Gulag system. The millions of kulaks and enemies of the state were imprisoned in over 100 Gulag camps during the 1930s. Prisoners worked in sub-zero temperatures without adequate clothing, shelter, or food, resulting in high mortality rates of between 1.5 and 1.7 million deaths across the Gulag system. Major projects like the construction of the Belomor Canal, the Siberian Railway, and the Baltic Sea Canal were built by forced labor. This also reveals a moral problem. Industrial statistics cannot be celebrated when production depended on enslaved labor and mass death. Let's now extend our focus to the political terror that also increased the number of deaths. The Great Purge represents the side of human cost that had nothing to do with economic policies. From 1936 onwards, Stalin's Great Purge targeted perceived enemies through show trials. Communist Party members were charged with treason, espionage, and sabotage, which they were not guilty of. Most confessed to fabricated crimes to protect their families. The Kirov assassination on 1 December 1934 is widely believed to have been ordered by Stalin himself and then used as pretext for purges. Military leadership was the main target, such that 2/3 of senior Red Army officers were either arrested or executed. This arguably, to some extent, weakened Soviet military capacity before World War II, thus contradicting Stalin's stated security rationale for embarking on the 5-year plans. Nikolai Yezhov, the chief officer of NKVD, allegedly set quotas whereby each district was required to shoot 28% of those arrested. Yezhov himself was executed in 1940, demonstrating the purge's self-consuming nature. From this, it becomes clearly self-evident that the purges served no legitimate economic or security purpose. They terrorized the population and eliminated competent personnel, directly contradicting the claim that Stalin's policies strengthened the USSR. This terror soiled industrial achievements by creating a society based on fear rather than genuine socialist solidarity. As we draw closer to the end of this essay, let us now focus on the social successes that complicate our assessment of Stalin's success as having been soiled by appalling human costs. So we put it in such a way that allows us to easily refute the social successes to maintain our line of argument while making the essay appear to be balanced. Take note of how we insert the word limited to downplay the social successes. To provide a balanced evaluation, we must acknowledge the limited social improvements while critically assessing their significance against the overall human costs. The regime implemented some beneficial social policies like the expansion of healthcare services. Doctors increased from 70,000 in 1928 to 155,000 in 1940. Trained midwives also increased significantly. Vaccination campaigns against tuberculosis and diphtheria reduced child mortality. Sanitation campaigns reduced some infectious diseases. In education, compulsory primary education increased enrollment up to 95% by 1932. This had the positive effect of improving literacy, such that literacy rates rose to 94% in urban areas and 86% in rural areas by 1939. Technical training created a skilled workforce. However, education also indoctrinated the youth with communist ideology and reinforced Stalin's personality cult. Women could now become part of the workforce and participate in the economy, as this was encouraged through the introduction of workplace creches and daycares, which enabled mothers to work. The 1936 Family Code banned abortion, except when the mother's life was at risk. It provided maternity benefits and paid leave. Incentives were offered by the state to have large families, and divorce was made to be 12 folds more expensive. The reason for the 1936 Family Code were to repopulate after collectivization and purge-related deaths. In essence, it was mere replacement of those that had been killed as a result of Stalin's policies and was not done out of genuine concern for women's welfare. Healthcare improvements were inadequate because they could not compensate for state-caused famine and poor working conditions that killed millions. Living standards remained poor despite some improvements because ordinary citizens' quality of life remained deplorable. This thus proves that these gains cannot outweigh the human costs if the said gains cannot fully be enjoyed under the state-sponsored terror. In concluding, we must weigh the competing claims about transformation and human costs. We need to ask ourselves these short probing questions. Were the 5-year plans instrumental in transforming Soviet Russia? The answer would be yes. USSR became the world's second industrial superpower whose capacity enabled survival against Nazi invasion from 1941 until 1945. Infrastructure and urbanization fundamentally restructured Soviet society. Did the transformation come at significant human costs? The answer would be yes. Famine deaths were between 6.5 to 8 million, combining the Holodomor and the Kazakh famine. Gulag-related deaths were between 1.5 and 1.7 million. The Great Purge victims were around hundreds of thousands to millions. Dekulakisation deaths were unknown hundreds of thousands as well. Deaths related to industrial accidents were around tens of thousands. Can the successes and the deaths be weighed against each other? This essay's position is that economic gains and human costs cannot be meaningfully balanced because ends don't justify the means. Industrial capacity achieved through mass death and slavery cannot be morally defended. Agriculture failed because terror undermined efficiency and ordinary people's lives worsened. Success depended on atrocity because forced labor built canals, while famine induced rural flight provided industrial workers. So transformation and human costs cannot be treated as separate phenomena, when in reality the human cost was the means of transformation. Forced labor built infrastructure. Famine-driven migration created the urban workforce. Terror enforced impossible targets. So our conclusion thus goes like this. From the above given arguments, it is more accurate to say that indeed Stalin's 5-year plans achieved substantial but uneven industrial development through systematic state violence which raises questions of morality. Success was not achieved despite human costs. It was achieved because of and at the expense of millions of human lives. Genuine progress depends on whether industrial statistics can be separated from brutality that produced them. This essay showed that they cannot be separated. While the 5-year plans transformed Soviet industrial capacity, this transformation was compromised by its dependency on atrocity.